The Duke of Kestrel Chase did not look at her as he pronounced her sentence. "You will go to Gullswater Lodge. It is fitting." The words were not shouted. They were dropped into the oppressive silence of his study, like stones into a deep well. Fitting. Constance Bellamy felt the word settle over her, a shroud of quiet injustice. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing but the clarity of one's vision, and she needed to see everything very, very clearly. It had begun, as such things often did, with a piece of jewellery, a sapphire brooch, heavy and ornate, belonging to her cousin Rosamond. They were all guests at Kestrel Chase, the vast and sombre estate of the recently widowed Duke Gideon Sinclair. Her aunt, Lady Arabella Bellamy, had pursued this invitation with the single-mindedness of a hawk, her daughter Rosamond the intended prize for the grieving Duke. Constance, as ever, was merely part of the luggage, the unpaid companion and secretary whose role was to be both indispensable and invisible. She managed the correspondence, mended the torn lace, soothed the vapours, and faded into the wainscoting whenever a gentleman of consequence entered the room. That evening, during a small musicale, the brooch had vanished from the dressing table where Rosamond had carelessly left it. A frantic, whispered search had escalated into a hushed scandal. It was Lord Osmond Vickers, a man whose polished manners never quite concealed the acquisitive glint in his eyes, who had first given the accusation its shape. He had been courting Rosamond with a languid persistence that her mother encouraged, seeing him as a suitable fallback should the Duke prove unobtainable. "Miss Bellamy has such sharp eyes," Lord Vickers had murmured to a cluster of guests, his gaze sliding towards Constance, "and such quick, clever fingers. She manages all of her aunt's affairs, you know. Remarkable, really." The implication was as subtle and as venomous as a serpent in the grass. Now, standing on the Aubusson carpet in the Duke's library, the accusation was no longer subtle. It was a blunt instrument. Lady Arabella was performing a masterful display of distressed motherhood, her handkerchief pressed to her brow. "My poor Rosamond is devastated. Such a sentimental piece. And to think, in this house, by one I treated as my own." Her voice trailed off in a delicate sob. Rosamond, pale and genuinely upset, stood beside her mother, twisting a ribbon on her dress. She would not meet Constance's eyes. The Duke sat behind a desk of dark, unforgiving mahogany, his face a mask of aristocratic control. Gideon Sinclair was a man carved from granite, his grief for his late wife having chipped away anything soft or superfluous. He was known for his silence, his abruptness, and an almost obsessive reliance on fact. He looked at the faces before him, the weeping aunt, the fretful cousin, the smoothly concerned Lord Vickers, and then his gaze finally, heavily, fell upon Constance. It was not a kind look. It was analytical, cold, and searching. "Miss Bellamy," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the light in the room. "You were in the West Wing corridor at 8:30. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "I was, Your Grace," Constance replied, her own voice steady and clear, a stark contrast to her aunt's histrionics. "I was returning a book to the library." "Lord Vickers says he saw you near Miss Bellamy's door." "His lordship's eyes do not deceive him. My own room is adjacent to my cousin's. I passed her door on the way to my own." She kept her hands clasped loosely before her posture erect. She would not fidget. She would not plead. "And you saw no one else? Nothing amiss?" "I saw a housemaid, a girl named Nan, carrying a fresh ewer of water. Nothing else." The Duke's eyes, a startlingly pale grey, narrowed slightly. He was watching her hands, her face, the unflinching set of her jaw. He prized evidence over emotion, and the scene before him was awash with emotion. All except for her. She was a small island of calm in a sea of calculated turmoil. He saw the careful darn in the cuff of her gray dress, the worn leather of her shoes. She did not look like a thief. She looked like a woman who knew the precise value of every last thing she owned. Lord Vickers stepped forward. "Your Grace, perhaps the girl was tempted, a moment of weakness. If she would simply return the brooch, I am certain Lady Arabella would be inclined to leniency." Constance's head turned, and she fixed Lord Vickers with a look of such quiet, profound contempt that he faltered. It was the first spark of fire anyone in the room had seen from her. The Duke saw it too. He was trapped. An accusation had been made in his house. A guest had been robbed. Action was required. To dismiss it would be a failure of his duties as a host. To call in the magistrate would create a vulgar public scandal. He needed to remove the problem. He needed to isolate the variable. He rose from his chair, a tall, imposing figure who seemed to cast a shadow over them all. "The matter will be investigated. Privately." His eyes returned to Constance, and the judgment came. "In the meantime, you cannot remain at Kestrel Chase. My estate at Gullswater Lodge on the coast is presently empty. You will go there. You will remain there until the brooch is found." A gasp came from Lady Arabella, this one entirely genuine. Gullswater Lodge was infamous. A crumbling, remote manor perched on the edge of the salt marshes, it was said the cellars flooded with every high tide, and the winter winds could strip a man to the bone. It was not a residence. It was a place of exile. "Gideon, that is severe," Lord Vickers began, a frown of concern etched on his brow. He had perhaps hoped for a confession and a quiet dismissal, not this dramatic banishment. The Duke's gaze cut him off. "It is my decision." He looked at Constance, expecting a plea, a protest, a final, desperate burst of tears. He received none. Constance simply inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement, not submission. "As you wish, Your Grace." Her composure was unnerving. It was unnatural. To the others it looked like guilt, a cold acceptance of a just punishment. But to Gideon Sinclair, a man who had spent a year drowning in a silent, screaming grief, her control looked like something else entirely. It looked like strength. It was this thought, unwelcome and unsettling, that followed him long after Constance Bellamy had been escorted from the room to pack her few belongings for the journey to the flooded manor. She had not asked for a coat. She had not asked for a companion. She had simply walked out, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more damning than any confession. The journey to Gullswater Lodge was a descent into a landscape of gray. Gray sky, gray sea, gray stone walls lining the winding, rutted track. The carriage wheels sucked at the mud, and a persistent, chilling drizzle beaded on the windows. Constance sat alone, her small trunk at her feet, and watched the lush greenery of Kestrel Chase give way to wind-swept moorland and stunted, salt-blasted trees. She felt not fear, but a strange, hollow sense of release. For the first time in 10 years, since her parents' death had left her a ward of her ambitious aunt, she was not under Lady Arabella's watchful, critical eye. Whatever awaited her at Gullswater, it would be hers alone to face. The lodge itself appeared suddenly out of the mist, a grim silhouette against the churning sea. It was a Jacobean relic of dark gray stone, streaked with green damp. Many of its windows were boarded over, and the gardens were a tangled wilderness of bramble and thistle. A single plume of smoke rose from one of its many chimneys, a lonely signal of life. The carriage pulled to a halt before a heavy oak door studded with rusted iron. The driver, a man from the Kestrel Chase stables, unloaded her trunk and left it on the mossy step without a word, eager to be away before the tide turned. As the sound of his carriage faded, a profound silence descended, broken only by the cry of gulls and the relentless sigh of the waves. The door creaked open, and a woman stood there, holding a lantern despite the watery daylight. She was tall and raw-boned, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and an expression that looked as if it had been weathered by the same salt winds as the house. "You'll be Miss Bellamy," she said. It was a statement, not a question. Her eyes, a sharp, intelligent blue, raked over Constance from head to toe, taking in the simple traveling dress and the lack of a lady's maid. "I am Mrs. Perkins. I am the housekeeper, and the cook, and everything else besides." "I am pleased to meet you, Mrs. Perkins," Constance said, her voice clear and steady. The woman grunted, a sound of profound skepticism. "Come in, before the damp gets in your bones, assuming it isn't there already." She led Constance into a great hall that smelled of mildew, wood smoke, and something else, the faint, briny tang of the sea itself. The air was frigid. A fire struggled for life in a cavernous hearth, casting flickering shadows on walls where the outlines of removed paintings were visible as cleaner rectangles of stone. Dust motes danced in the weak light slanting from a high, grime-caked window. "The Duke sent word you were coming," Mrs. Perkins said, her back to Constance as she prodded the fire. "Said to make a room ready. There's one in the south wing that's mostly dry. The rest," she waved a hand vaguely, "the sea claims what it wants." "I understand the cellars are flooded," Constance said. Mrs. Perkins turned, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "They are. Every spring tide. The old seawall was breached 30 years ago, and the last Duke never saw fit to repair it. This one's not been here in a decade." She looked at Constance again, a new kind of assessment in her gaze. "You're not what I expected." "And what did you expect, Mrs. Perkins?" "A fine lady. Hysterics. Crying for her maid and her hot bricks, demanding things I can't give." "I have no maid," Constance said simply, "and I am not in the habit of making demands. I am, however, very good with accounts, and I know how to mend a roof leak if you have a ladder and some tar." Mrs. Perkins stared at her for a full 10 seconds. The hard line of her mouth softened almost imperceptibly. "The ladder's rotten, and we're out of tar," she gestured with the poker. "Your room is up the stairs, second door on the left. Supper is at 6. It'll be broth and bread. Don't expect more." Constance found her room to be clean, but achingly bare. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, a small wardrobe, and a single chair. A threadbare rug lay on the wide, dark floorboards. The window looked out not towards the sea, but over the ruined garden and the bleak expanse of the marshes. She unpacked her few belongings: 2 more dresses, a change of linen, her sewing kit, a book of poetry, and a small, leather-bound volume of her father's architectural drawings. It was all she owned in the world. That evening, she ate her broth and bread in a small, cold parlor with Mrs. Perkins, who watched her with an unnerving intensity. Constance did not complain about the food or the chill. Instead, she asked questions. About the estate, about the tenants, if there were any, about the state of the larders, the condition of the roof, the last time the chimneys had been swept. Mrs. Perkins answered in clipped monosyllabic sentences at first, but as Constance's questions grew more specific and knowledgeable, her answers lengthened.
She spoke of the 2 tenant farms, barely scratching a living, of the constant battle against the damp, of the old ledgers in the estate office, untouched for years, their pages warped by the wet air.
"May I see them?" Constance asked. "The ledgers. What for? Nothing in there but debts and decay." "Order," Constance said, almost to herself. "There is comfort in order." The next morning, Mrs. Perkins led her to the estate office. It was the coldest room yet, lined with shelves of moulding books. On a large desk sat a stack of leather-bound ledgers, coated in a fine layer of dust and green-tinged mould. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper. Constance ran her fingers over the cover of the top volume. Gullswater Estate, 1828. She opened it. The pages were stiff, the ink faded and blurred in places by damp. She spent the entire day in that office. She carried the ledgers one by one to the parlour and laid them carefully before the fire to dry. She found a pen, a pot of ink that was blessedly still liquid, and a few sheets of fresh paper. She began the painstaking work of transcribing, of making sense of the faded entries, of imposing the logic of numbers onto years of neglect. She was not merely passing the time. She was building a defense against the chaos of her situation. This was her work. This was her purpose. A week later, the Duke arrived. He came unannounced, riding a great black stallion that seemed to absorb the grey light of the landscape. He found Constance not weeping in her room, but on her knees in the vegetable patch with 2 local boys, Jem and Tam, whom she'd hired for a few shillings a day. Her dress was tucked into her boots, her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, and her hands were covered in mud. She was showing them how to construct a raised bed, using salvaged timbers to lift the soil above the waterlogged ground. He dismounted and watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She did not notice him at first, her attention focused entirely on the task at hand. "No, Jem, the cross-brace must be flush," she was saying, her voice crisp with authority. "Otherwise, the weight of the wet soil will push the boards apart by spring." Finally, she sensed his presence and looked up. She straightened slowly, wiping a muddy hand on her apron, her face smudged with dirt. There was no deference in her gaze, only a cool appraisal. "Your Grace," she said, her tone even. "Miss Bellamy." He walked closer, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. "I see you have been industrious." "Idleness is a luxury I cannot afford, Your Grace, nor can this estate." She gestured to the work they had done. "The soil here is good, just too wet. With raised beds, we can grow enough to see us through the winter, but I require more timber and seed. And I have identified the primary source of the flooding in the west cellar. The old sluice gate is jammed with debris. If it can be cleared, it will alleviate the worst of it. It will require 3 strong men and a block and tackle." She was not asking for comfort. She was not complaining about her exile. She was presenting him with a plan, a budget, a list of requirements. She spoke to him not as a disgraced dependent, but as a steward of his land. He was silent for so long that she thought he might be angry. His grey eyes moved from her face to the work she had started, to the grim facade of the house, and back to her. He had come expecting to find her broken, ready to confess to anything to escape this place. He had found a woman rebuilding it. "Mrs. Perkins has the household accounts," he said finally. "I am aware," Constance replied. "She has given me a budget for the household. It is not sufficient to cover the necessary repairs." "And you have calculated what would be sufficient?" "I have." She reached into her apron pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. It was a list, written in a neat, precise hand, with costs itemized next to each entry: timber, nails, tar, lime mortar, seeds, a new pump for the well, and wages for 3 men for 1 month. He took the paper and read it. The numbers were exact. The reasoning was sound. It was the work of a mind that saw the world in terms of structure, cause, and effect. It was the work of a mind very much like his own. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. "Very well," he said. "The funds will be made available. Send one of the boys to the estate office at Kestrel Chase tomorrow. They will be given what you require." He turned to leave, then paused. "The brooch has not been found." "I did not expect it would be," she said quietly. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw the intelligence in her clear brown eyes, the steadfast set of her mouth, the quiet dignity that clung to her like a second skin. It was not pity he felt. It was something harder and more respectful. It was the unsettling recognition of an equal. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away, the rhythm of its hooves a steady, powerful beat against the damp earth. Constance watched him go, then turned back to her work, a single, unfamiliar seed of hope beginning to take root in the desolate soil of her heart. The Duke's funds arrived as promised, and with them a transformation began. Gullswater Lodge, which had been sinking into a slow, damp decay, started to breathe again. The sluice gate was cleared, and for the first time in years the water level in the west cellar dropped by 2 feet. The most egregious leaks in the roof were patched with new tar. The chimneys were swept, and the fires began to burn brightly, chasing the persistent chill from the stone walls. Constance, working alongside Mrs. Perkins, Jem, and Tam, became the heart of the revival. Her days were filled with physical labor and mental calculation, a combination that left her exhausted but deeply satisfied. She dedicated her evenings to the Gullswater ledgers. By the light of a single candle in the small parlor, she painstakingly restored the water-damaged pages. She learned to make a paste of rice flour to mend the tears, and with a fine brush she carefully retraced the faded copperplate script. The ledgers became her companions, telling a story not just of accounts, but of a place. She learned the names of tenant families going back generations, the yields of harvests long since past, the cost of a new bull in 1810, the slow, creeping neglect that had set in after the old Duke's death. In the precise columns and balanced accounts, she found a world of order and reason that was a balm to her own disordered life. Gideon's visits became a weekly occurrence. He would arrive on a Tuesday afternoon, always unannounced, under the guise of inspecting the repairs. He would walk the grounds with her, his long silences punctuated by direct, practical questions. "The new mortar is holding? Have the winter cabbages sprouted? What is your next priority?" Constance would answer him just as plainly. "The mortar is holding, but the east wall will need repointing come spring. The cabbages are sprouting, but we will need to cover them against the first frost. My next priority is the library. The books are molding. They are a history of this place, and they are being lost." During these walks, a quiet rhythm developed between them. They rarely spoke of personal matters. They did not speak of the theft, or of her aunt, or of his late wife. They spoke of stone and soil, of drainage and harvests. Yet, in these conversations, a different kind of intimacy grew. He saw the keenness of her mind, her deep and unsentimental understanding of the land. She, in turn, began to see past the cold, grieving Duke to the man beneath, a man who cared deeply for his inheritance, who valued competence above all else, and whose silences were not empty, but full of observation. One afternoon he found her in the library, where she had enlisted Jem to help her carefully wipe the mold from hundreds of leather-bound books. She held up a small, slim volume.
"This is a book of local botany compiled by your great-grandmother," she said.
She has made notes in the margins about the medicinal uses of the marsh herbs. It is fascinating. He took the book from her, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a startling jolt through them both. He looked down at the delicate, spidery handwriting in the margins, and then back at her face, animated with intellectual curiosity. He had not seen such life in a woman's face in a very long time. "I did not know this existed," he said, his voice softer than usual. "This house is full of forgotten things," she replied, her gaze steady. He stayed longer that day. Mrs. Perkins, who had transitioned from grudging acceptance to fierce loyalty, served them tea in the parlor. It was the first time he had taken refreshment at Gullswater. He sat in a worn armchair near the fire, watching Constance as she spoke of her plans to restore the old herb garden, using his great-grandmother's book as a guide. He saw how her presence had warmed the cold rooms, how her quiet determination had breathed life back into the forgotten corners of the estate. He was beginning to realize that he had not exiled her to a ruin. He had sent her to a place that was simply waiting for her to bring it back from the dead. And in watching her do it, he felt parts of himself, long dormant and numb with grief, begin to stir. As the first bite of winter sharpened the air, news from the outside world began to trickle in, carried by the boy who brought supplies from the town of Netherfold. The talk of the county was that the disgraced Miss Bellamy was living in squalor, a just punishment for her thievery. Lord Vickers, it was said, was being lauded for his gentle handling of the affair, and his suit with Rosamond was progressing rapidly. Lady Arabella was reportedly telling anyone who would listen that she had always known Constance had a devious nature. The narrative had been set, and she was its villain. Constance heard these reports with a familiar ache of resignation. Reputation was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the well-aimed stone of a lie. She had no means to fight it, except to continue her work, to build something real and tangible at Gullswater that would stand in defiance of the whispers. The opposition, however, was not content to let her be. Lord Vickers, sensing the Duke's continued and, frankly, baffling interest in the remote estate, grew uneasy. His plan had been to remove Constance from the picture entirely, solidifying his own position with the Bellamys and, by extension, the Duke's circle. The Duke's regular visits to Gullswater were a complication he had not foreseen. He needed a more permanent solution. He needed to destroy not just her reputation, but her credibility. He found his weapon in the household ledgers at Kestrel Chase. With the help of a discreet forger in Saltcliffe, he contrived a new entry on a carefully removed and replaced page in the previous year's accounts. The entry was simple: a payment of £20 to C. Bellamy. There was no note as to its purpose, leaving it open to sinister interpretation. Blackmail, payment for some illicit service, or perhaps compensation for a previous theft that had been quietly handled. It was a masterpiece of insinuation. He arranged for the page to be discovered by a clerk, who, in a state of great alarm, brought it to the Duke's attention. The news of this discovery reached Gideon on a cold, sleeting afternoon. He stood in his study, the ledger open on his desk, and stared at the entry. The clerk's worried face, Lord Vickers's grave expression as he confirmed the handwriting, looked similar to Constance's. It all built a compelling case. A cold, familiar numbness washed over him. He had allowed himself to see something in her: strength, honesty, a spirit that matched his own. Had it all been a clever performance? Was she simply a more accomplished deceiver than the rest? The doubt was a bitter poison. He had been betrayed once by life, by the sudden fever that had taken his wife. He would not be made a fool of by a woman he had mistakenly begun to trust. He rode to Gullswater that same day, the sleet stinging his face, his mood as black as the storm clouds gathering over the sea. He found Constance in the estate office, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the biting cold, her head bent over the Gullswater accounts. The candlelight cast a warm glow on her focused expression. She looked up as he entered, a small, welcoming smile touching her lips before it vanished at the sight of his face. "Your Grace," she said, rising. "Is something wrong?" He did not waste time with pleasantries. He strode to the desk and threw the Kestrel Chase ledger down upon it. It landed with a heavy thud. "Explain this," he commanded, his voice raw with a tightly controlled fury. He pointed a finger at the forged entry. Constance bent forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. She read the line, her eyes scanning the date, the name, the amount. She was silent for a long moment, her face betraying nothing. He had expected denial, tears, a flurry of excuses. He was prepared for it. He was not prepared for the quiet, analytical calm that settled over her features. She looked up at him, her gaze direct and unwavering. The trust that had grown between them hung in the balance, a fragile thread stretched taut in the cold air. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice betraying a slight tremor, not of fear, but of an anger that matched his own. "It was found in my accounts," he bit out. "The evidence is plain." "No," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The forgery is plain." She met his furious gaze without flinching. "Look closely, Your Grace. The ink. It is Parker's Everblack. It has a particular sheen. Your household has used it for years, but this entry," she tapped the page, "is written in a common iron gall ink. See how it has begun to brown slightly at the edges, even though it is supposedly a year old? Parker's does not do that. It is also a finer nib than your steward uses." He stared at the page, his anger beginning to war with a reluctant astonishment. She was right. The ink was subtly different. "Furthermore," she continued, her mind working with the cold, precise clarity he had come to admire, "the date, the 14th of May. On that date last year, I was not at Kestrel Chase. My aunt took myself and Rosamond to Saltcliffe for the sea air. My cousin contracted a fever, and we were delayed there for 3 weeks. We did not return until the 2nd of June. She straightened up, her chin high. Dr. Ellery of Saltcliffe attended her daily. His records will show it. The inn where we stayed will have a bill. There is evidence, Your Grace. Real evidence. Not this clumsy fabrication." Her plain, honest speech, delivered with the unshakable confidence of the truth, was like a bucket of cold seawater in his face. The poison of doubt was washed away, replaced by a profound and chilling shame. He had been so ready to believe the lie, so quick to retreat into the safety of his own cynicism. He had almost thrown away the one true thing he had found in a year of desolate grief. He looked from the forged page to her face, pale but resolute in the candlelight. He saw not a criminal, but a woman of formidable intellect and unbending integrity. He saw the woman who had brought his forgotten estate back to life, and he felt a surge of cold, protective rage on her behalf, directed at those who had tried to destroy her. "Who?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Who would do this?" Constance looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed a flicker of her own weary pain to show. "Who benefits the most from my complete and utter ruin, Your Grace?" He did not need her to say the name. Lord Osmond Vickers. It was all there, the smooth concern, the helpful suggestions, the careful positioning. He had orchestrated the entire affair, from the missing brooch to this final, desperate gambit. Gideon reached out and closed the ledger with a decisive snap. The sound echoed in the small, cold room. "This ends," he said, his voice flat and absolute. "Now." He looked at Constance, and the formal barrier of their stations seemed to fall away. "They will not harm you again. I will not allow it." It was a vow, a promise made not by a duke to a dependent, but by a man to the woman he now knew, with absolute certainty, he could not bear to lose. The annual winter ball at Kestrel Chase was the pinnacle of the county's social season. It was an event Gideon had dreaded, another hollow performance of his duties as duke. But this year, it was not a duty. It was a stage, and he would be the director of the drama that was about to unfold. He sent a carriage to Gullswater with a message for Constance. It contained only 2 items: a simple, elegant gown of deep blue velvet, the colour of a winter twilight, and a note. "You will attend. G.S." It was a command, but she understood it as something more. It was a summons to her own vindication. When she arrived at Kestrel Chase, the great house was ablaze with light. Music drifted from the ballroom, and the drive was choked with the carriages of the local gentry. She was no longer the invisible companion in a drab grey dress. In the velvet gown, with her hair styled simply by a bewildered but cooperative Mrs. Perkins, she possessed a quiet, striking beauty that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with her own innate grace and strength. Gideon was waiting for her in the great hall. He dismissed the footman and took her cloak himself. He looked at her, his pale grey eyes filled with an emotion she did not dare to name. "You are here," he said. "You summoned me, Your Grace." "I did." He offered her his arm. "There are some people I wish for you to meet." He did not lead her to the ballroom. Instead, he guided her down a quiet corridor to the library, the very room where her sentence had been pronounced. Inside, a select group was assembled before the roaring fire. Her aunt, Lady Arabella, and a pale Rosamond. A smug Lord Vickers standing beside them, and 2 other figures. A portly man with spectacles, whom she recognized as Dr. Ellery from Saltcliffe, and a formidable old woman with eyes as sharp and grey as the Duke's own, seated in a high-backed chair. This was the Dowager Duchess Eleanor Sinclair, Gideon's grandmother, a woman whose opinion could make or break any reputation in the county. The Dowager Duchess surveyed Constance with undisguised skepticism. "So this is the little thief," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "This is Miss Bellamy, grandmother," Gideon corrected her, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The lady who has single-handedly saved my Gullswater estate from ruin." He led Constance to a chair near the fire, and then turned to face the room. "I have asked you all here to resolve a delicate matter. Lord Vickers, you were instrumental in bringing to my attention a certain discrepancy in my household accounts." Vickers inclined his head, a model of helpful concern. "I only did my duty, Your Grace. It was a painful discovery." "Indeed." Gideon's voice was like ice. "Painful,
and, as it turns out, entirely fraudulent. A collective gasp went through the room. Lady Arabella's hand flew to her chest. Vickers's smile tightened. The entry in question, Gideon continued, was a forgery. A clumsy one at that. He gestured to a small table where a third man, a paper and ink specialist from Uminster, was waiting. In a few concise sentences, the expert explained the inconsistencies of the ink, the paper, the pen nib, all confirming what Constance had first observed. The Dowager Duchess's sharp eyes narrowed, her gaze shifting from Vickers to Constance. "Furthermore," Gideon said, turning to the physician, "Dr. Ellery,
Can you confirm for us where Miss Bellamy was on the 14th of May last year?" Dr. Ellery cleared his throat. "I can indeed, Your Grace. Miss Constance Bellamy was at the Royal Hotel in Saltcliffe, nursing her cousin, Miss Rosamond Bellamy, through a severe bout of influenza. She did not leave her cousin's side for nearly 3 weeks. I have my patient logs to prove it." The silence in the room was thick with astonishment and dawning horror. Lord Vickers's face had lost its colour. Lady Arabella began to stammer, but Gideon held up a hand to stop her. "It seems clear," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that Miss Bellamy could not have received a secret payment here at Kestrel Chase when she was 50 miles away. It also seems clear that someone went to great lengths to fabricate evidence against her." His gaze settled on Vickers, and it was as cold and unforgiving as a winter sea. But the question is, why? He did not wait for an answer. He turned to Constance. "Miss Bellamy, during your restoration of the Gullswater accounts, did you happen to find anything unusual?" This was the moment. Constance rose, her composure absolute. She held a slim, restored ledger in her hands. "I did, Your Grace. For the past 5 years, the rents from the 2 tenant farms at Gullswater were collected not by the estate factor, but by a private agent, on behalf of my late uncle, Sir Reginald Bellamy." She opened the ledger. The agent's name was Lord Osmond Vickers. Vickers took an involuntary step back. "This is preposterous!" "Is it?" Constance's voice was calm and devastatingly clear. "Because according to the Gullswater records, the tenants paid £20 per annum. Yet according to my uncle's accounts, which my aunt graciously allowed me to manage, he only ever received £10 per annum from each. Over 5 years, Lord Vickers, that is a discrepancy of £100, a sum you appear to have pocketed for yourself." She looked at him directly. "Theft, I believe, is the correct term for it." She had done more than defend herself. She had prosecuted him. She had used his own weapon, the ledger, against him. The room stared, speechless. "And the brooch?" the Dowager Duchess snapped, her sharp gaze fixed on Constance. "A distraction," Gideon answered for her. "A way to discredit the one person with a mind sharp enough to uncover his scheme." He walked to his desk and opened a small drawer. He produced the sapphire brooch and tossed it onto the table. "I found it caught in the fringe of a drawing-room chair the morning after it was reported missing. I kept it because I suspected the accusation was more important than the object itself." The trap had closed. Lord Vickers was ruined, exposed as a common cheat and a slanderer. Lady Arabella, implicated as his dupe and a cruel guardian, shrank into herself, her social ambitions turned to ash. Rosamond began to weep quietly, not for the drama, but for her own shallow weakness. The Dowager Duchess looked from the cowering Vickers to the composed figure of Constance Bellamy. A slow, thin smile spread across her wrinkled face. "Well," she declared to the room at large,
The girl has a mind, and it appears my grandson has finally found his.
After the wreckage had been cleared, Lord Vickers escorted from the house in disgrace, a sobbing Lady Arabella and a mortified Rosamond dispatched back to their rooms to await a carriage in the morning. A profound quiet settled over the library. Only Constance and Gideon remained, standing by the fire. The great house was silent around them, the music from the distant ballroom having finally ceased. Gideon walked over to the table where Constance had left the Gullswater ledger. He picked it up, feeling the worn leather, the result of her patient, careful work. He set it down on the mantelpiece, a place of honor. Then he turned to face her. The air between them was charged with everything that had not been said during the weeks of their practical, professional acquaintance. The firelight flickered across his strong, severe features, softening the hard lines, revealing the deep well of emotion he kept so tightly guarded. "You restored Gullswater," he said, his voice low and rough. He took a step closer. "You took a place that was cold and forgotten, and you brought it back to life." He took another step, until he was standing directly before her. He looked down into her intelligent, steady eyes. "You restored this house. You have restored me." Constance felt her breath catch in her throat. This was more intimate, more revealing than any flowery declaration could ever be. He slowly reached out and took her hands. They were not the soft, useless hands of a society lady. They were capable, strong, the hands of a woman who knew how to work. He held them as if they were precious. Then, to her utter astonishment, the Duke of Kestrel Chase knelt before her. He did not kneel with the theatrical flourish of a courtier, but with the quiet gravity of a man making a solemn oath. He looked up at her, his proud, guarded face stripped bare of all artifice. "Constance Bellamy," he said, and the sound of her name, spoken so plainly, so seriously, was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "I am not offering you a rescue. I am asking for a partner. I am asking you to choose. Will you choose to stay? With me?" Plainly. Tears she had refused to shed in her darkest hour now welled in her eyes. Not tears of sorrow or self-pity, but tears of a profound and overwhelming joy. She had been seen. She had been valued not for a pretty face or a family connection, but for her mind, her strength, her very self. She had endured, and now she was being given the chance to choose. She knelt down, too, so that they were face to face, equals in this new, uncharted territory. "Yes," she whispered, the word full of all the hope she had thought long lost. Plainly. "Yes." He reached up and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. And in the warm, fire-lit library of Kestrel Chase, surrounded by the quiet testimony of books and history, Gideon Sinclair leaned forward and sealed his vow with a kiss. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. A quiet, certain meeting of two souls who had found their home not in a place, but in each other. 1 year later, winter had come again to Kestrel Chase. But it was a different kind of winter. The great house was no longer a place of echoing silence and somber grief. It was filled with warmth, with the scent of beeswax and baking bread, with the sound of quiet laughter. Fires burned in every hearth, and the corridors, once cold and daunting, were now pathways in a well-loved home. Constance, now the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, stood in the library, her library, looking out the tall window at the snow blanketing the park. The landscape was white and still, beautiful in its peace. Behind her, the Dowager Duchess Eleanor sat by the fire, pretending to read a book of sermons, but in truth, watching her new granddaughter with sharp, affectionate eyes. The old woman had become Constance's most vocal champion and her most entertainingly cantankerous companion. A quiet domesticity had settled over their lives. Rosamond, humbled by her family's public disgrace, had written a heartfelt letter of apology. She had since married a quiet country vicar in a distant parish, a match of modest affection rather than grand ambition, and in her letters she sounded happier than Constance had ever known her to be. Lady Arabella, stripped of her credibility and her wealthy suitor, had retired to a small house in Bath, where her dramatic pronouncements now fell on less sympathetic ears. Gideon entered the library, his boots silent on the thick carpet. He came to stand beside Constance at the window, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a familiar, comfortable gesture. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the snow fall. Their love was like that, quiet, deep, needing few words. "The final accounts from Gullswater arrived this morning," he said. "The tenant farms both reported their best harvest in 20 years. Mrs. Perkins sends her respects, and a request for 3 more blankets for Jem's new baby." "See that she gets 6, Constance replied with a smile. Gullswater was thriving under her remote stewardship, a testament to the order she had brought to it. She still kept the first restored ledger on a shelf in the library, a reminder of where their story had begun. "I have something for you," Gideon said. He reached into his pocket and placed a small, velvet-wrapped object on the table beside them. Constance unwrapped it. Lying on the dark velvet was the sapphire brooch. It glittered in the soft afternoon light, no longer an object of accusation, but simply a beautiful thing. "It belongs to Rosamond," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "I thought perhaps we could send it to her as a Christmas gift, a way of closing the last page of that chapter." He looked at her, his gaze serious. "The lie that brought you to me. I am grateful for it every day." She looked from the brooch to his face, the face she had come to know so well, the strength in his jaw, the intelligence in his eyes, the way his mouth softened when he smiled at her. She thought of the cold, damp ruin that Gullswater had been, and the warmth of the home they had built here together. The winter that was meant to be her undoing had become the season of her greatest joy. "Not the lie," she said, her voice full of a quiet, certain happiness. "The truth that the lie revealed." She reached up, and drawing his head down to hers, she kissed him, sealing the end of one story and the beginning of a life, together, plainly. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.